Hello friends, I'm Lydia Foxglove and I'm a fantasy author and have been a fantasy author for most of my adult life. Today I want to talk about a particular aspect of my background, one that has been integral to my creative life and also one that is a little weird and that I have gotten a lot of questions about over my life. I don't have any formal education, well, almost none. I attended public school for 2nd grade. My mom wanted to get a massage therapy license, and so she sent me and my little sister to public school for that 1 year. And after that, I continued to go to gifted class for 1 day a week from 3rd to 5th grade. But I'm not really sure if I would call gifted class a conventional education anyway. My first gifted class teacher basically devoted one entire class to us just telling ghost stories in a circle. She was awesome. And then I had another gifted teacher who made us each pick a president and then spend the entire year studying that president. Like, we got hardcore into these presidents. And there were a lot of kids in the class and we all got like a different president that we chose, and I just happened to pick FDR because I thought his name was cool, and it turned out that he's one of the presidents that's done the most stuff. So I think back on how bored I got of FDR, and I can only imagine what like the kid who picked, I don't know, who's the most boring president. There's a lot of contenders. In fact, I would argue that pretty much all presidents are boring when you're 9 years old. So otherwise, besides learning everything there is to know about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I had no formal education. Legally, I was homeschooled. I'm sure most of you have heard of homeschooling, even though YouTube is pretty international and I don't really know what homeschool laws are like globally. In America, most homeschooled kids follow some kind of curriculum or structure. Their mom is somewhat of a teacher, although the level of oversight can vary. And a lot of them are very religious, which can get very awkward, especially when I was homeschooled. There weren't a lot of us, so sometimes we'd all be together in the same homeschool group. And I was in like the hippie homeschooler faction, and then you had like the religious homeschooler faction, and we didn't understand each other whatsoever. So we'd be playing a game and I'd be like, I'm a white mage, and they'd be like, you're going to hell, and I'd be like, but no, I'm a white mage. I had no sense of this whole thing, even though I was actually fairly familiar with the Bible, just not like the Harry Potter and Dungeons and Dragons are sending you to hell track of it. Anyway, we had very minimal curriculum. Some math and math textbooks particularly, but like 80% of it was unstructured. And if you know what unschooling is, then you know, and you can skip a few minutes. But if you don't know, let me sum it up really quick. Unschooling does not have textbooks, lessons, grades, curriculum. It trusts kids to follow their own interests and do whatever they want to do. That doesn't mean you might not have some household rules governing, say, social media usage, for example. It doesn't even mean that your kids can't go to school. I would count a kid saying, hey mom, I really want to go to school, as actually still unschooling because the kid decided to go to school. But generally, if you're an unschooled kid, if you want to, you can spend like your entire day writing stories, drawing comics, playing pretend games, making games, which is what me and my sister did. And there are a few reasons I wanted to talk about this here. For one thing, there are not a ton of accounts of adult unschoolers out there, especially the older ones, because homeschooling and unschooling were like barely legal when I was a kid. So there aren't a lot of like 40-something unschoolers. Most of the ones on YouTube that I've seen are younger adults. So I just wanted to share my story in that regard. And two, I just think it's a crucial aspect of how I came to be living this creative life. You don't have to be unschooled to live a creative life, obviously. But do I think it helped? Yes, it absolutely did. My sisters are both professional artists and I'm a professional writer, and I think it was a huge advantage for all three of us. And thirdly, I think that you can still be unschooled as an adult. Like, you can start unschooling yourself right now if this philosophy appeals to you. I feel like I am basically a big free-range child right now, and I have no regrets about that. But first, my usual disclaimer, my videos are not advice, or they're only advice if they resonate with you. There is no one good way to live. There is no one way to write books. There is no magic bullet to life that applies to everyone. None of this is meant to disparage schools or different parenting styles or to make you feel attacked for things as a parent that you're just not able to handle. I certainly have known kids that would lose their damn minds if they were not in school all day. They need friends or they need structure or whatever. But it might not surprise you to know that I lean introverted and I found school to be absolute hell. And it must be said that before I even reached school age, I was the epitome of little bookish baby genius. And if that sounds like a brag, it is not. All my fellow gifted kids know it's like more brain, more problems or something like that. You are afraid to fail at anything, you have anxiety, you get older and suddenly you went from being like the lauded genius child to just being like one kid in a sea of thousands of genius children that were all just the smartest child in their tiny town. And then you have a crisis and you have to figure shit out for yourself. But I was a very good candidate for self-directed learning because I was just naturally a voracious learner. I would go to the library and come out like, all right, I got my week's rations. I read loads of fiction, loads of nonfiction. I was always writing as soon as I knew how, or even maybe before. I was a very weird kid, precocious, nerdy, neurotic, shy, and yet I also had an entire Steve Martin record memorized that I would gladly recite for any available audience. Be obsequious, purple, and clairvoyant. Well, it must not have been very important or you wouldn't have forgotten it. Oh, I remember. I'm radioactive. Yeah, I think I still got it. So, throwing a bit of a ham, when my parents enrolled me in 2nd grade, it was severe culture shock. It was like I had moved from a foreign country. At that point, I had no idea what normal kids were like. I had never heard of New Kids on the Block. I had weird hippie lunches that no one understood. I had all kinds of weird life philosophies already ingrained in me that were not compatible with school. Oh, hello. It's you again. Hello, Betsy. At one point, I thought that I could just like get all the kids to sort of write up new rules for how the school should operate. And if we all agreed on it, I could just bring it to the teacher and she'd be like, okay. She quickly informed me that it does not work that way. And I immediately dropped it. I don't have a rabble-rousing bone in my frail little body. I'm the kind of kid that if I see a no trespassing sign when I'm wandering around with my friends, I'm like, guys, it says no trespassing. I'm gonna tell mom. I basically spent all of 2nd grade just marveling at my unpleasant sojourn in this unfamiliar land. I couldn't get over how much time was spent in line and how little time was spent reading. I was like, I have so much reading to do and here's stupid school getting in my damn way. My anxiety really spiked that year and it did not let up for a long time. But when the year was over, we left school and it was back to business as usual. Reading, writing, drawing, making elaborate floor towns out of Legos and Brio trains that we refused to clean up for 30 days or more, and waiting breathlessly for any and all airings of DuckTales and Full House. And our lives pretty much continued in this vein until I got a boyfriend and a job. Well, maybe not so much with the Brio train floor town and the DuckTales, but most of the rest of it. I was still playing elaborate pretend games with my sister pretty much right up until I moved out of the house. Which, side note, I was very embarrassed about. One thing that you younger millennials and Gen Zers might not realize how lucky you are is that before the internet, if you were a weird kid, you thought that you were the weirdest kid. I had no idea that there were like LARPers or women writing gay fanfic about Star Trek characters in the 70s or early anime clubs or people who thought they were vampires or, you know, like when I got on the internet, it was a glorious revelation that whatever weird thing I was thinking, someone else was thinking something 10 times weirder and broadcasting on the internet. And it was like, oh, so now I'm no longer embarrassed. I can just admit that it was an amazing childhood. But there was definitely concern from people around us, which brings me to addressing a few of the concerns that still dog homeschoolers and unschoolers to this day. The number one question you get when you're homeschooled is, how do you socialize? And the answer is, you don't. You just get real weird and you like it. Seriously, There are ways to see other humans outside of school, like homeschooling groups or taking a class or going to a regular event at the library. And like, we had friends. They were usually the children of my mom's friends, so I didn't always get the most choice in what friends I was going to have, but it would be the same in a small town. We also spent more time around adults, which is the way that the real world is going to work anyway. But I am definitely shy, and when I was younger, I was pretty socially awkward, which is unfortunate because if you go to public school, no one there is shy or socially awkward. Everyone's just like A+, and they know how to talk to everyone, and none of them are ever awkward at all. Yeah, school is not really a fix for that. But I will tell you what I did get out of school is near immunity to peer pressure. I don't know if this is true for all homeschooled kids, but I'm not gonna see my peers again anytime soon, so I don't care if I please these people or not. The second question we always got was, how do you learn math? How do you learn science? What do you do if your kid doesn't want to learn those things? What do you do if your kid doesn't learn to read? I can't say a whole lot on the reading thing because I was just like born reading, but my younger sister was much slower to read. She didn't read until she was like 7, and now she reads a ton. But my mom just kind of let her take it at her own pace, and when she did start reading, she loved it. I don't know if that's true for every kid because obviously some kids have learning disabilities, some kids just maybe never like to read, but I will say in many cases, if you give kids a little time, they will take to something on their own schedule. So let's talk about math for a minute. Do you remember any of the math that you learned that you don't actually use and you didn't care about? I'm guessing the answer is no, unless your memory is amazing. And yet for some reason, people seem to think it's really important to spend a lot of time on something that you're going to forget like 2 seconds after you take the test to prove that you learned it. My parents, as I said, actually did pressure me to learn some math. I had to go through math textbooks. This is one area where we really weren't unschooled. Basic math was easy. I remember struggling with long division, but then once I got it because you actually do use long division sometimes. And then we got to algebra, and I just hated algebra. I didn't understand. I still don't really know what algebra is. There are obviously reasons for some people to know algebra, but I've never needed algebra in my real life. And because I was bad at algebra, I got it in my head that I was just bad at math. I was generally a smart kid, but I was terrible at math. I suck at it. What I didn't realize is that I was actually using math all the time. I was making up various like gaming systems. I loved Final Fantasy and other role-playing games, and so I would try to make like a version of that I could play like on paper because I couldn't always play video games. So I was doing all this stuff with numbers and calculations, and I also got really into like making up mock statistics for my characters. So I was actually using a lot of math with complete ease. I just didn't realize that it was math. So I kept thinking I was terrible at math and being really down on myself about it, and I actually wasn't. I was good at math. I'm sure that if I had a reason to apply algebra to my daily life tomorrow, I could probably pick it up really quickly. But as long as I don't see how I'm going to apply it, it doesn't stick. And I think it's genuinely worth asking, if you're not interested in something, do you need to learn that thing? Like, I am just not really that interested in any aspect of science. I'm more of a history person, I'm more of a sociology person, so I know some things about science through those channels. I know like the history of certain scientists and scientific discoveries and how they impacted history. And if something piques my interest, I will seek it out. Like when COVID was happening, I became kind of interested about the history of infectious diseases and what we did during the flu epidemic. So I read a few books about epidemics and vaccine development and things like that. So it's not like I don't know anything about science. My natural curiosity leads me to learn some things in all areas, but I can't say that I really learned the things about science that I would have learned in school. However, the things I have studied, I remember very well because I cared about them and they had some kind of relevance to my story or what was going on in the world. There was some particular reason I was always following that subject. I think it's better to spend your time learning about things that you're going to remember, and this applies to kids too, of course. If you want to get a kid a more well-rounded education, I would find those ways to sneak it in. Like if you have a history kid and you want them to learn some science, try to tie that in with their natural interest. But anyway, I don't have kids, so I'm not going to go too deep down the advice hole. And then there's a third question that was somewhat relevant when I was a kid, but it really pops up now. Like, I know parents who will just ask me like, well, what would your mom have done about this thing? Or or how did you handle technology with unschooling? Because unschooling is very much about letting the child choose what they want to do with their time, but we have a lot of technology that can be very addictive that we didn't have when I was a kid. So a lot of parents are intrigued by the idea of having more unstructured education for their kids, but they're wondering, is my kid just gonna play video games all day? And I don't have an easy answer to that one. My time with video games and computers was naturally restricted in the 90s by what kind of technology a middle-class household had available at the time. We were pretty normal. We had one TV. So I had to share my video game times with my mom's Oprah viewing and a cartoon my little sister wanted to watch and so on. And then we had one computer, so if I wanted to use the computer, that also had to be shared with all of the family's needs. My dad at one point did give me a laptop so that I could write on it in my room, which was awesome, but it was like 30 pounds. I don't even know if the display was color. Like, you couldn't do anything on this laptop except write a document. So I do think the one thing, like if I had kids now in this crazy world, the one thing I would probably really try to think about is dopamine addiction. I'm not afraid necessarily of a kid who loves video games because I love video games and I got a lot of ideas out of video games and I relax through video games. There's a lot of benefit to all these technologies, just like social media. If you're using social media a lot as a kid, that can really accelerate your career or give you career opportunities you might not otherwise have had. However, we all know that social media has this dopamine addictive quality and kids don't necessarily know how to manage that. In fact, adults don't necessarily know how to manage that. So as soon as they can remotely comprehend that idea, I would be talking to them about how addictive social media is, and I would be thinking about that when I set up the household rules. And I also would, of course, talk to them as soon as possible about how social media is not necessarily an accurate reflection of someone's life. Like, I'll tell you right now, the rest of my house is a disaster, and usually when I'm at home, I'm just wearing like sweatpants and a nerdy t-shirt I bought on clearance at GameStop, but I dressed up for you, and I keep my little corner clean. As we know, it's all full of lies. So I would love to know how actual parents are managing that problem, because I do think that is genuinely difficult. And then we get to college. What about college? Well, years of homeschoolers have proven that colleges are actually pretty happy with homeschooled kids, so I'm hoping that's not as much of a concern as it was when I was young. But also, I didn't go to college. And it was one of the best decisions I could have made because I don't have any student loans. And I spent some of those years working seriously on my writing craft. And none of my sisters went to college either. I think we all felt like we already had the tools to do what we wanted to do and that we were already very good at learning new things that we needed to know when necessary. And since none of us were really into being doctors or lawyers or any of those disciplines where you definitely want the person to not be like, oh, I just watched a bunch of YouTube videos on brain surgery, I know what I'm doing. By the time we hit adulthood, I think we were all very good at disciplining ourselves and working hard, because that's kind of how our childhood had evolved. When we were little, we were just doing more free play, but then as we got older, we would get very serious about the things we were into. Like at one point, when I got into anime and manga, there was really no manga translated, or at least very little manga translated. And I got really into the idea of translating my own manga, which meant I had to learn Japanese. So I got out all these books from the library about learning Japanese, and I got a volume of Sailor Moon, and I locked myself in my bedroom with like a guide to the Japanese writing system, at least hiragana and katakana. And on one day I taught myself all the hiragana, just like in this crazy whirlwind, and I started immediately translating the manga. It was a terrible translation. A lot of it I couldn't figure out. I had no experience at it, but you know, I was going hard. And that's kind of how self-employment works. It's very deep and focused work, and you have to be very dedicated to what you're doing and able to set your own schedule. So I was very prepared for that. And it's part of the beauty of humankind that we all have different things we're naturally drawn to and different ways of learning them. So that path wouldn't work for everyone, and being self-employed wouldn't work for everyone. I just want to reiterate that again, this worked for us, and it will probably work for a lot of people, but it's also not going to work for many people. For me though, the way I grew up influenced my life tremendously. I don't know who I would be without it. When I was a kid, I really learned to value my time, my creative interests, my creative space, and what we might call self-care now. There was very little emphasis on having the most, making the most money, being publicly successful, being beautiful, or having new cars, or any of those material desires. There was not even really any pressure to like go to college, go to a good college. My parents never really emphasized material wealth or status. And I suspect that while that isn't necessarily a factor of unschooling, those two things do complement each other very well. And that doesn't necessarily align with the mainstream. Countless times I have encountered people who have tried to make me want things that I didn't previously want. There was a time in my 20s where I had several people unrelatedly all tell me, "You'd be so much prettier if you plucked your eyebrows." I don't know if you can see, but I do have like a little bit of a Frida Kahlo thing going on, and I actually kind of like it because I like Frida Kahlo and I kind of like my eyebrows. I don't really feel like I would be prettier if I plucked my eyebrows. And also, I don't really care. And I'd be on my lunch break at work and I'd be studying Japanese or reading nonfiction or drawing or something. People would be like, "That's weird." And I think, "You're weird. You got a whole lunch break and you're just gonna waste it watching Jerry Springer on the TV up there when you could be learning a new language?" Yes, I do sound like a bit of a snob, don't I? I still feel like I managed to lose my way a little bit in my 30s when making money felt so imperative. I started to focus not just on making enough money to have the life that I really wanted, but to focus on making the most money. And that was where I started to feel like something was off. So I've reset myself and I've reconnected with the things that were important to me back then. And I'm remembering that it is pure joy to learn something that you love to learn about. And it doesn't matter what. It could be a craft that you never intend to monetize. It could be some aspect of history that you don't really need to know, or a language that you don't have any real use for, but it's just fun. And humans are also different. We all gravitate toward different things, which is really pretty beautiful, that we just kind of naturally fall into different areas and we all complement each other in that way. And not only is this cycle of learning things and creating things pure joy, it also taught me what is worth pursuing in life. A lot of things that we tend to chase are not pure joy. They're just there to impress someone else, to keep up with what others have, to hoard things we don't have time to use, or just to get that quick hit of dopamine. I've been guilty of all of those before myself, and I'm sure I will be again, but I always try to go back to that pure joy I felt as a kid when I was just lost in something, in learning something or creating something. I always come home to that idea, to remember what brings me a personal joy that isn't there to impress anyone else. Which is not to say that you should live your life selfishly, of course. I get a lot of joy out of helping friends and being part of the community and working in the bookstore and contributing to my small town. But that's all good because all of those things do give me pure joy, and I'm finding more balance in my life. So that is how unschooling has helped me keep in mind what is important to me as an adult. And if any of you had any kind of alternative education of any kind, or are raising your kids that way, I'd love to hear your experiences, whether they were positive or negative. I don't really know how universal this is because I don't actually know very many unschooled adults. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I hope all of you watching this feel a little bit inspired to take some time out for learning and creating anything that feels joyful and maybe even a little frivolous. Go be a kid for a little bit. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe. I talk about a variety of topics, including writing fantasy, editing, world building, publishing, books I loved, and more just general lifestyle particularly creative lifestyle topics like this one. And I'll see you next time. Bye. Some math and max epidemics and